I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay to introduce an address by the head of state.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, I have the honor of introducing the pre-recorded message for the statement at the general debate of the United Nations, the address of His Excellency Luis Lacalle Pou, President of Uruguay. Thank you very much. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Ambassador Volkan Bozkir, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, distinguished heads of state and government, national representatives, and representatives of international organizations, ladies and gentlemen. The 75th anniversary of the United Nations finds us once again in the midst of a crisis, one of an undoubtedly different nature to the catastrophe triggered by the Second World War, but one which also forces us to rethink our future in order to consolidate the progress made and also prevent future crises, whether they be financial, health, climate, or all of them at the same time. The scope of the current pandemic and the painful results in terms of losses of life and the effects on the health of many people focuses our attention, for it becomes necessary to find solutions for our peoples, especially for the most vulnerable and most exposed to suffer the severest effects of this pandemic on health as well as on their livelihoods. But the commemoration of this anniversary should also lead us to think about the future we want for our countries and our societies beyond this crisis. It is before this General Assembly, Mr. President, that once again Uruguay wishes to stress that the road we take both to get out of this pandemic and for the next 75 years will always find us on the same side, on the side of multilateralism, supporting the search for solutions that are framed in multilateral legal settings in all aspects of international life, health, the environment, trade, and migration. A few months ago, Uruguay joined the Alliance for Multilateralism, an initiative to defend the multilateral order launched by France and Germany. It is yet another example of Uruguay's commitment to the cause of multilateralism. Mr. President, Uruguay supports the role of the World Health Organization and the part that the United Nations system plays in coordinating the global response to this pandemic, with the understanding that international organizations have the fundamental role of coordinating and orienting us towards a search for the best solutions to the current crisis and a coordinated management of the impact of the crisis on the medium and long term. Uruguay has joined the call for fair global access to healthcare, technology, to medicines and vaccinations through the sharing of knowledge, intellectual property, and the necessary data to detect, prevent, treat, and respond to COVID-19. Uruguay's response to the pandemic has had a multidisciplinary focus. It is social, economic, and epidemiological, monitored by an honorary scientific advisory group we are very proud of. It is based on the responsible freedom exercised by our citizens with solidarity and generosity. This, together to a strong, resilient healthcare system, has made it possible for us to resume work schooling and cultural activities. We also wish to make an appeal here to the international community for the current pandemic not to lead to a weakening of compliance with the commitments made at the multilateral level. We must avoid falling into scenarios of nationalism and protectionism, which could harm international relations, international trade, or break the supply chains and impede the circulation of medical supplies that are so sorely needed to emerge from this health crisis. At the beginning of the decade of action to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, we must move from words to action, and this is a necessary condition to put an end to poverty, protect the environment, and improve living conditions of the world's population. The United Nations have promoted the 2030 Agenda, and this must be kept, despite the major current difficulties, as a central guide to achieve progress in sustainable development. Uruguay has worked tirelessly since the SDGs were approved for effective compliance. Our country continues to honor its history by reducing inequality as well as its focus on decent work supported by investment and growth. We have also taken an irrevocable commitment to education at all levels, which is so badly needed for human beings to fully realize themselves and for all citizens to have the same opportunities. This global pandemic has shown that faced with ever-changing challenges, it is important to keep the necessary conditions and support for international cooperation so that all states, especially developing countries, can make progress towards sustainable development. In this setting, it is paradoxical that countries like Uruguay, classified as a high-income developing country, should not have access to the greater part of sources of international credit or more favorable credit lines. For this reason, we continue to promote the review of this classification or graduation, which is based solely on per capita income. For these categories to be really appropriate and fair, a multidimensional criterion should be considered to define the degrees of development and the needs for international support for each country based on its own reality. In this vein, I wish to stress the support of ECLAC in order to develop a multi-factor criterion. Sustainable development could not be called sustainable if we had no concern for the environment. Like the pandemic, this too is a challenge which countries cannot face alone. It calls for a collective will to face the challenges which are before humanity. Uruguay continues making progress in this area with the recent creation of a Ministry of the Environment as a demonstration of the priority that this issue has for the government. Mr. President, Uruguay once again wishes to express its support to the Paris Agreement on climate change and its firm commitment with the goals set in this area. Uruguay has developed a national response system to climate change to prevent its risks, to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. We understand that best practices and the effective work should be for accountability faced with the current challenges deserve a greater focus and acknowledgement. We also celebrate the fact that the Biodiversity Summit will be taking place next week, and we express our commitment to promote sustainable use and practices of biodiversity and natural resources, developing mechanisms for their best management and use. Uruguay wishes to stress before the General Assembly its support for the Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation. Uruguay understands that for these initiatives to prosper and effectively contribute to achieving the SDGs, digital technologies must be able to overcome the digital divide and the connectivity divide, both within countries and among different countries. It is also indispensable that human rights be respected in networks. The protection of privacy and personal data, as well as access to information and freedom of expression, both public and private. Lastly, we must work on digital security with broad participation of state actors, the private sector, and civil society. Referring to the initiatives of the Secretary General, I wish to focus for a moment on his call for a ceasefire, a global ceasefire, which my country endorses. A peaceful environment is indispensable to respond to the pandemic. This is why we must redouble our efforts towards dialogue, the peaceful resolution of conflicts, and the rule of law in order to palliate the suffering and bring hope to the most vulnerable populations. Uruguay is strongly committed to the peace forces of the United Nations. We are one of the largest per capita troop contributors. This is a clear demonstration of our national commitment, as well as the offer our government has made to install a laboratory to increase medical diagnostic capacity in the United Nations peace operations in the framework of this pandemic. Let me recall Uruguay's call to defend hospitals and schools that are being attacked in conflict zones, and the need to support the Security Council's resolutions in this area. Uruguay reiterates its commitment to the human rights agenda and will continue to actively advocate the defense of human rights. This includes the protection of the rights of children, the situation of civilians in conflict, and the rights of women, as well as the respect of these human rights by the international community. In this context, we will continue advocating the effective application of the mechanisms to defend human rights by the United Nations. I wish to make special mention of the existence of vulnerable sectors of the population which are most affected by the pandemic, such as women who are victims of domestic violence, a problem of special concern for Uruguay, which has led us to develop specific policies to respond to their situation. Neither should we forget the migrants and the internally displaced, who are even more vulnerable to this pandemic. Let me stress here the open policy of Uruguay as a receiver of voluntary migration, based on the values of democracy and equality before the law and respect of the rights of all people, regardless of their origin. Mr. President, through the strengthening of human rights, not only will we make progress in the protection, we will also achieve the empowerment of those who are called to be fundamental actors in the building of peace and of development. I am speaking of women and young people. Lastly, I wish to stress the role of the International Criminal Court and the importance of its deterrent effect against genocide and mass atrocities and their perpetrators. Uruguay reiterates its commitment to the international justice system, particularly its support to the International Criminal Court as an independent, impartial legal institution with a central role to play against impunity and in the search for justice. In this forum, where peace was sealed 75 years ago, I wish to express my concern at the dangers which arise because of non-compliance with disarmament agreements or the withdrawal of certain parties, which could lead to renewed arms races, dragging us back to a time when the world lived under the shadow of a possible nuclear conflict. There cannot be peace in the world if there are no serious commitments by the international community for disarmament and non-proliferation. Uruguay is concerned at the proliferation and illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons, which are a threat to the stability of regions and for global security. They feed crime and insecurity, and this affects peaceful coexistence within societies. My government has committed itself to combat insecurity and crime, and we are working unflaggingly to this end. We will also continue cooperating with the United Nations in the fight against terrorism, transnational organized crime, and the links between both. Mr. President, the future we want for our peoples is one where we can make progress towards common solutions in solidarity to the challenges facing us, to achieve sustainable and inclusive development, where the rights of all are respected and opportunities are provided for the development of each and every one of the citizens of this world without leaving anybody behind. We want a peaceful future, a world where states will focus on dialogue and negotiation, where we will find ways out of the current conflicts, which will protect the rights of all parties. To this end, we need to redouble our efforts for preventive diplomacy and mediation, for conflict prevention. And to this end, we need a United Nations that will act with more coordination, both in discourse and in practice. An organization that will be actively related with other international organizations, including financial ones, in order to be able to implement a range of mechanisms which will make it possible for countries to overcome external and internal obstacles to their development, and ensuring that all dimensions of development are covered. Uruguay is particularly interested in increasing the relevance of the general action of the United Nations, particularly that of the General Assembly, as well as all member states having the possibility of effectively participating. Uruguay has always sought to contribute to the general transparency of the operations of the United Nations Organization and all its bodies, including the work of the Security Council. At the present time, we will assess the possibility of increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization at the same time as we contain the financial costs of operation and increasing the transparency and accountability of expenses. We give special value to the efforts of the organization to include civil society and the private sector as part of the solution to the economic, social, and environmental problems facing us, since inclusive, sustainable development calls for the participation of all sectors of society. World leaders must rise to the circumstances and to the needs of our people and be able, just as our leaders were 75 years ago, to think beyond the current crisis and consolidate the multilateral mechanisms and instruments which make it possible for our societies to achieve sustainable inclusive development with respect for democracy, for freedoms, and the rights of all human beings. The leaders of the world must be responsible. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Eastern Republic of Uruguay for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Seychelles to introduce an address by the head of state.